Greetings, book lovers everywhere, and welcome to E-Train Talks. I'm E-Train, a 12-year-old literacy advocate, booktuber, and kindness promoter, and the host of E-Train Talks. Today's podcast is going to be amazing, because in today's interview, it's been a long time coming. I sometimes can't believe how lucky I am, and today is yet another example of how reading changes lives. I'm thrilled to share that I have the incredible honor of talking with the amazing Newbery Honoree and New York Times best-selling author, storytelling mastermind, the author of dozens and dozens of captivating and entertaining books, some picture books, some middle grade, some YA, some even for adults. I'm talking with the one and only author Shannon Hale. Welcome to E-Train Talks.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here.
Well, I'm so happy that you're here, and I'm sure everybody listening is incredibly excited to hear more about your journey and your books. So for those who aren't yet in the know, Shannon has written over 40 stories, from picture books to middle grade to YA and adult, as I just said, and her writing has captured the attention and the hearts of so many. So I'm incredibly fascinated, and I asked questions and found answers on the internet, but I'm still extremely curious for this interview, and I'm sure all of you are as well. So without further delay, let's get into the first question.
All right.
Yeah. The first question is a little bit of a flashback. So I met Shannon at Teen Author Boot Camp in Provo, Utah last March, and March 2023 in case you're watching this in the future. So I knew from that moment on that she would not just be an amazing interview, but she seems like an amazing human as well, after she gave an incredible speech after receiving an award for her awesome books. So, I'm curious to start, how did you connect with Teen Author Boot Camp?
I am born and raised in Utah, and I live here now. And Teen Author Boot Camp is headquartered in Utah. So just over the years, in the way that you do when you're in the same business, I would meet
Yeah.
the people at different events, and I've participated in their programming. They're fantastic programming several times. And a couple of times I've got 4 kids, and when my oldest was a teenager, he participated in the workshops and the camps, and I would drive him down there and be the mom.
Well, that sounds like a lot of fun for your kid, and now it also sounds super cool to be involved in a deeper kind of author level as well.
Yes.
So my next question is about your middle grade book specifically. So as a middle schooler myself, I see and experience, for that matter, so much drama and all this crazy stuff at school. And your books tackle a little bit of bullying. And I'm sure everybody in middle school, except you were super popular, but I feel like nobody really avoided bullying. We all can relate to some of your characters who experienced some bullying. So I often try to write down my experiences, but it can be incredibly tough, especially if you're in the moment. So, what prompted you to start to write down your experiences from middle school, and how did you end up writing what happened so vividly and relatably in your Real Friends series? You got elementary school, middle school. It's just amazing. How did you do it?
Oh, thank you, Adrienne. That's so nice of you. Yeah. So when I started working on Real Friends, at that point, I had done maybe 30 novels. So novels were and some Princess and Black early chapter books, but novels were mostly what I had done. I had done a couple of graphic novels in the 2008, around that area. But I had a daughter who was having trouble with friends, and the only books she wanted to read at that point in her life were graphic novels that were realism, especially Raina Telgemeier and
Mm-hmm.
Cece Belzell Defo. She really wanted to know that what she was reading had really happened, and she wanted to feel like she wasn't the only kid going through hard times. And I'd had so many things happen when I was a kid. I'd been through a lot of hard times too with friends. But when your mom sits down and goes, when I was your age, it was so rough. It's just not as, I needed to reach her where she was.
Yeah.
And so I thought, I had so many stories from my younger years. I thought maybe I'd incorporate into fiction books. But then I started to see the value of telling a true story. I had never considered writing a memoir before that because memoir sounds like something that really important historical people write where they record their experiences.
Yeah.
And my childhood wasn't especially traumatic. I think every childhood is traumatic
Yeah.
because we go through hard times, we experience sad things, but it wasn't like I had, a more traumatic childhood than an average person. So I
Mhm.
didn't think I had a story worth telling, but I found that there was a lot of power in just telling the truth. Hey, I really struggled. I had a hard time with friends, and I really didn't think that I did Real Friends with Leywin, illustrated by Leywin Pham, who's my best friend. And we were friends when we started, but we became best friends through the process of making those books. I was talked to her for an hour today on the phone. We're very close, and that was a very bonding experience. But I truly didn't think that that book would reach a wide audience. I thought there might be a few people who could connect with it, and I've never had a book find audience so fast. It came out on a Tuesday. And by Friday or Saturday, I was on book tour and I was in different states and I was meeting people who had already read it 20 times. I mean,
Wow.
I was just like, "What? Came out 4 days ago. How is that possible?" And I think that just shows how universal so many of these our experiences are as human beings. So Real Friends goes to about fifth grade. Best Friends is about sixth grade. And then I skipped seventh grade because honestly, I just hadn't written that much in my journal about it, and it was also a really hard year. But I had a lot to say about eighth grade, and that's where we ended. But my goal was just simply just to say, bare my soul and be like, this is how it felt to me to be this age. These were the things on my mind. These were the struggles that I had.
So, my next question for you is about kind of before you became an author. So, you were actually, I read that you were involved in improvisational theater when you were younger. And I just think channeling your emotions through the arts, well, I mean, writing is the arts, but I feel like drama, in a sense, is a different kind of art. Like, you kind of get to express. Okay, I'm going on a rant here about how I just love theater. So I think what you're doing was super cool. And do you think that your time in theater influenced your writing at all? And if so, what way? Or am I just asking a question that's completely false?
No, you're absolutely correct. When I was younger, uh, people ask me, like, why you became a writer. And it's simply because I just always had stories in my head. But
Mhm.
before I started writing stories down, I would make up the way I would express those stories was through basically theater, but not in a organized sense. I would just get
Yeah,
my friends and be like, "Here's the story. Here's the characters. Here's who we are," and we would, that's what play is like
yeah.
pretend plays improv, right? We would improvise a story where we would play different characters. We were runaway orphans. We were secret spies, whatever we were
Yeah,
doing. And but I was like the game maker. I was the one that was coming up with the ideas all the time. And
the
then
one
once
behind
I
it
had a
all.
teacher in 4th grade. What's that?
Oh, you're like the one behind it all.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I'm Caesar Flickerman, or no, what's his name? Heavens
I
be.
don't know.
Uh, I'm trying to think of Hunger Games. But, yes, and I, started writing them down because I had a 4th grade teacher who had us writing stories down, and until that moment, I didn't even think that that was something a person could do. It's not like I knew any writers.
Yeah,
I read books, but I didn't think about the writers who wrote them being real people.
yeah,
It wasn't in the 80s. It wasn't like it is today, where authors come to your local bookstore or come to your school and do an assembly. We just didn't have access to children's writers at all. I didn't know they were still alive. I thought they were extinct like dinosaurs. So having that experience open up writing to me, but I always still loved theater. In middle school, I started taking theater classes and started doing summer theater camps. And I started auditioning for and getting into productions in my local community theater. I never got big roles. I never got the leads. But I just love, love, love theater. I love
yeah.
collaborative storytelling. I'm not a singer, so I never got cast in the musicals, but I just liked, my favorite part were rehearsals. I just love being in a
Yeah,
group doing that kind of storytelling. And then improv, I did a lot of improv in high school, and then I had a friend who was in improv comedy in college that really we rehearsed a lot. We practiced mechanics. We put on some shows. It was terrifying, but I think the things that really come out of most of that for me, that translate into writing is some of the rules of improv are like accept what you are given.
Mhm.
So sometimes people call that yes and. So if you're going like this and you think you're milking a horse or
Oh.
milking a cow or a horse, and then someone else comes on stage and says, where are you driving to, trucker? And you're like, oh, this is now a steering wheel. Instead of saying, what are you talking about? I'm milking a cow. You just go with it. You accept whatever you're given, and so it requires you to think on your feet. And it's so often, even with an outline, when you're writing, suddenly something comes up in the writing that you hadn't anticipated. And you can go, that's not in the outline, throw that out. Or you can look at it with curiosity and go, ooh, is my subconscious feeding me like a really interesting plot twist?
Yeah.
Is this a background detail, a character I didn't know that's going to make this story richer? So improv has definitely taught me how to kind of take what's there and make something more out of it.
What's super interesting that I discovered is that you actually wrote stories in secret for a long time. Why did you feel the need to hide your true love of writing from others? And how did it feel once you were able to share your stories and became a published author and fulfilled your dream?
Yes, these are all such good questions. So when I was younger, I first just declared I wanted to be a writer when I was like in fourth grade.
Mhm.
Um, and when I was that age and said I want to be a writer, people were like, "You can do it," because they don't take you seriously. You're so cute, sure you can.
Yeah.
And then I found by the time I was like eighth grade, and I was saying I want to be a writer when I grow up, people's reactions, especially adults, were like, "Ooh, it's really hard. You know, don't get your hopes up."
Mm.
And and then even as I got a little older, like high school, I started to hear from my peers, yeah, everybody wants to be a writer, Like it's like saying, I want to be a fairy princess or I want to be an astronaut. It's
Yeah.
like I started to realize that it sounded like I was being immature and naive to assume that I could make it happen. And it was such a precious dream to me. I stopped sharing it because I was so sensitive, and the reactions were kind of soul crushing, that people didn't believe I could do it. And that they also thought I was ridiculous for even wanting to. So I started just tucking that in my heart and not talking about it. And, but I always wrote. But I just pretended that I wanted to be a teacher, or other things. Honestly, when I was growing up, there were not a lot of options for women. I was raised in a community where I did not see any female professionals. They were mothers or teachers, and that's all I really saw. So I didn't have a lot of mentoring that way, but I did keep that in my heart. And eventually, when I got to the point where I did love theater too, and I had to think, oh, I've got two impossible dreams. Which one could I not do without? And I eventually decided writing. I could live without acting as much as I love it, but I couldn't live without writing. And also, I just don't think I was a very good actress. So that was also being naive.
Yeah.
But it was when I was decided to go to graduate school and get an MFA in creative writing, which is not a requirement. You don't need a degree in writing to become a writer. You would if you wanted to teach it, but not just for publishing. But while you don't need it, I needed that. I needed a chance to um, take it seriously and
Yeah.
honor that, and keep working on my craft and be around other people who also took it seriously. So for me, the 2 years of graduate school were really helpful in that way. And ironically, people made fun of me for getting a master's degree in creative writing. They're like, what a useless degree. But ironically, I never had trouble finding work. I had worked for years before I eventually got published. And even though I couldn't make a living for many years at publishing, I was married and my husband had a full-time job. But when I needed work, I never had trouble finding a job because everybody needed writers. I wasn't hired to write novels,
Yeah.
but I was hired by other companies who needed writing in instructional design and other industries. So even in 2 recessions, I was able to find work. So when people were saying, "Oh, writing is useless," it wasn't true. It actually was a very useful, practical degree to get in addition to just giving me time to keep writing.
Yeah. And look at you now. You're now a New York Times bestselling author. You proved all of them wrong. I think what really is sad about society sometimes is like people try, like when you're younger, they try, like, you have a dream like writing, and they just try to push it out and they make it seem impossible. So, like the world has to bring you down. But I admire that you kept on pushing and kept on fighting for what you wanted to do. You followed your dream. Yeah.
I really believe in. I mean, there's something to be said for having, experiences something practical that you're going to be able to sustain yourself in the world in a career. But I really believe in following where your energy is leading you. People would say passion or love or whatever, but sometimes it's just your energy leading into where your energy is leading you, because that often is like a path that's going to open up for you, and create opportunities for you to sustain yourself as well as do
Yeah,
things that you love.
exactly. The next question for you is deeper into your passion for fantasy and for fairy tales. So, I mean, I have one book here, but I know you have so many more that dive into, I guess, the world of fairy tales, the world of princesses. But what's cool about your stories is that they're not necessarily that your princesses aren't the perfect person. They're not a Cinderella who finds a glass slipper. They're kind of like us in a crazy world, one that's not like ours, but their emotions are similar to us. They're middle schooler age, but they're also training to be princesses. I'm going on a ramble a little bit, but I just love your writing. And so, are you someone who reads the same books over and over, or watch the same movies over again? I know that sounds a little bit like off topic from what I was saying, but I think the way you write is really just different than a lot of other fairy tales. So, what about you kind of inspires you to be different than other fairy tale writers?
I love that. Yes, absolutely. I when you were talking about the princess thing, it right I saw my nephew this weekend, and he said he found some memes online about me, and they were like, writes book called Princess Academy, has no princesses in it. And there was another one, writes book called Best Friends, has no friends. And that made me laugh.
Yeah.
You can't always, I guess you can't always tell by my titles what's going on. But yes, as a kid, I did reread a lot. So, I didn't have access, what I have here in behind me with all of my books. I didn't have that growing up. And we really didn't go to the public library much. So my only access to books was my school library. And I would absolutely reread certain fantasy books over and over and over again. They felt like home to me. I would keep checking out the same books. I did read a lot of different books, but there were certain ones that I kept returning to. And when I was younger than that, there was this fairy tale illustrated collection of fairy tales that I had. I reread those ones a lot. So I feel like the makeup of my subconscious is largely formed from fairy tales because of that. But couldn't write just I was gonna say I couldn't write just a straight up fairy tale, but fairy tales are very complex and complicated
Yeah.
anyway. Um, but when you're writing something into a novel, it really changes the form. So,
Mhm.
for example, my first book was based on a fairy tale called The Goose Girl, which is like 3 pages long, and I made a 380-page book out of it. Because while the essence of it still has a fairy tale feel to it, I also wanted to take it very seriously. And what would it feel like to be there? And what would be at stake? And ask myself all the questions that the fairy tale left spaces for to come in and create new things out of it. And I do a lot of revision. I examine every word, every sentence, and my hope is always that my books are ones that would stand up to being read 20 times and someone could still enjoy it and find something new in it.
Yeah, and I hope that and I know that that's the case because I read through this once and already I just find myself not just wanting to read it again, but truly wanting to read it again. Like emphasis on the read, try to understand deeper and go deeper into the plot.
I think
So,
that that's really rereading is great for many things, but also for writers. Because sometimes when you're reading the first time, you're like just figuring it, going, what's going to happen? What's
yeah.
going to happen? And then the second time you read it, it gives you a chance to not only experience it again without just waiting for to see what's going to happen, but also to see how the writer does what they do.
Mhm. That's so true. And my next question for you is something that I've never really talked about in Train Talks because you actually have written written no, you don't write adults, you wrote novels for adults. Just like you don't milk a horse yet. Um, so I've interviewed a lot of authors, but they're all middle grade authors, and you are too, but you also have worked your way into the adult writing world. So, in fact, you've written the book Austenland and the series itself. So, I read that after a production of Austenland was shared at Sundance Film Festival, it was actually bought out by Sony for $4 million. So, and it became a major motion picture, which is super duper awesome. And why did you decide to write for an older audience after mainly staying in the children's audience, I guess?
Well, it happened very organically. So when I started writing my first, I wrote many, many things that have never been published. But my first book novel that was published is called The Goose Girl. And when I was writing that, I didn't know it was a young adult novel.
Mhm.
When I was growing up, we didn't have young adult novels. So after like the Newbery books, like your middle grade book, we
Yeah.
just went on to the adult books.
Mhm.
We really didn't. There were some existed, but they weren't in my library, and I didn't. They were not common. So I didn't even realize that this whole young adult category had gotten so huge. And when I eventually found an agent, she said, "This is young adult," and I was like, "Really?" But at the same time as I was writing Goose Girl, I was writing this other book called Austenland, which was for adults, and I thought they were both adult books.
Yeah.
So that's how I got into it, as I was already writing it by the time I was published for, I realized I was going to be published for young adults. So my first two books, Goose Girl and Anna Burning, I wrote thinking they were just fantasy novels without necessarily being a young adult. And the first book that I wrote thinking, oh, I could write with a young readers in mind was Princess Academy. So Austenland, yes, that was my first book for adults. It was published. And I actually co-wrote the screenplay with the director. And then we made it. It was an independent movie, and it was premiered at Sundance. And Sony Pictures purchased it to distribute it. So that, just to be clarified, the $4 million didn't go to me.
Yeah.
That was the payment
Yeah,
that
I should have clarified that.
Sony paid to the producers that had bankrolled the independent movie in order to distribute it. So I didn't become a millionaire from it, but I very much loved making it. And I was on set for the 7-week shoot, and I got to be involved with the whole process, which was really fun.
It does sound like a lot of fun, and I think it's extra special that you, the author, had a lot of say in the filmmaking because there have been films where authors kind of have to stand in the background while the I guess the professionals do everything, even though the
Yeah.
authors are the one who actually wrote the story, so why shouldn't they have a say?
I would say most movies are like that.
Yeah,
And I do understand it because a movie is completely different.
that's
So
true.
while I wrote the novel and I know the novel version of it, when you so I've written more than one screenplay adaptation of a novel, and I've also written graphic novel adaptations of novels. And so, having been part of that process, you realize you really have to I mean, you take the elements of it, but you're writing something entirely new. It has to
That's true.
stand up all on its own when it's in this visual medium. And a novelist doesn't necessarily really understand movie making enough to understand what's going to work on a screen versus in a book. And while I also got to be involved heavily in the process, it wasn't as though they came to me with every decision and be like, "Do you approve?" I got to co-write the screenplay and I got to be around, but I wasn't necessarily, consulted for everything. So it's not like it's my, personal creation. I got to be part of this enormous storytelling team. And I love, as I said, reason I love theaters, I love collaborative storytelling. So getting to be a little piece of that was very cool.
So, one of the most profound books of yours that I discovered is This Book Is Not For You.
Mm.
And it dives deep in a way that young kids can understand. It dives into the stereotype of girl books versus boy books. And I'm sure a lot of us as kids, and even maybe as you were getting older, we all experienced, like, I know right now, especially, as I'm reading so many different middle grade books, and sometimes bring them to school, and kids are like, "Why are you reading that? There's a girl on the cover. That's a girl book. Why are you reading that?" And that just really makes me shake my head, like do that thing where like people hit their foreheads, like they're just missing out on an amazing book. So, will you please share what the motivation behind This Book Is Not For You is, and was it based on personal experiences or something that you witnessed?
Yes. So my first book was called The Goose Girl. My third book was called Princess Academy. And I think because of that, the titles sound like they're gendered female. And I became really gendered as an author for girls. And people would introduce me. My first book came out in 2003. So this is a while back. But wherever I would go, people would introduce me as an author for girls. At bookstore events, the only people that would come would be mothers and daughters. When I would do school assemblies, I would have librarians introduce me to the school and say, "Okay, girls, you are going to love Shannon Hale's books. Boys, I expect you to behave anyway." And even more than once, I had schools that segregated my audience by gender and would invite the girls to come to my assembly and leave the boys out. And when I inquired, when male authors come to the school, did they do the same thing? And no, the whole school could be there for the male authors, but for female authors, only girls. And so I began to speak out about this because, of course, it's just silly and wrong to assume that boys cannot or would not enjoy a story about a female character. Additionally, not only are they capable of enjoying a story about a female character, it's actually beneficial for people to read characters different from themselves anyway in order to gain empathy. We should all have the opportunity to see ourselves represented in stories, but also we should have the opportunity to read stories about people different from us so we gain more empathy for other people. And this assumption, I think, was wrong. I think it was damaging. And I began to speak out about it about 15 years ago. And I get so much pushback for it. And I'm sorry that you are still hearing this because it's like, when are we going to get past this, you guys? Books do not have a gender. But I wrote a piece for the Washington Post, an essay about this a few years ago. And an editor read it and she asked me if I would write a picture book dealing with that topic. So that's where the picture book, This Book Is Not For You, came from, that request. But it also just came out of 15 years of my personal experiences of, people even in front of me. I would be at a bookstore and there would be a little boy who would want one of my books, and his mom or dad would say, "No, those are girl books," and pull him away. And I would say I've had these kinds of experiences, I mean, thousands of times in my career where I see people gendering books. And it does kind of break my heart that to see it, because I think boys are missing out on an opportunity to empathize with girls. And I think also kids, especially when they're younger, they don't care. It's the
Exactly. Yeah.
adults that care, that want to gender everything. The kids are like, they just want a story.
Yeah.
I care more about, like, as I've done signings, one of the most common questions I ask kids when they come up to my table to get a book signed, I say, "What kind of books do you like?" And again, thousands of times I've asked that question, and they'll say funny books, adventure books, fantasy, mystery. I've never once had a kid say, "I like books about boys." You know,
Yeah.
that's not what people care about when they're looking for a book.
I've spoken with authors whose it would be a dream come true for them to just write for one or the other as well. You somehow got involved with both of them. And how did the opportunities arise? And was there ever any backlash from the companies for the fact that you wrote for both, as they're huge competitors in a lot of facets?
Yeah. No pushback. In fact, it's really common with comic writers to do both. I know many comic writers that write for both DC and Marvel when doing the monthly comics. So when you're not an employee, when you're a freelancer, and illustrators too, they can move between the companies. I love comics. I love Marvel and DC. As a human being, whenever possible, I prefer not to ever take sides. I mean, there's some things, that you got to take a side on. But I think most us versus them kind of mentalities are illusions. I think we're all on the same team and have disagreements about the nuances rather than we are like all parts of different armies that must be, the other side is the enemy and we must battle. I don't enjoy that kind of mentality. So the first one that came to, which one was the first? Oh, well, what's funny is my husband, who's a lifelong comic reader, I really wanted to do graphic novels back when there were no graphic novel sections in bookstores. And every time I said graphic novel, I had to explain that it meant with pictures, not that it was graphic content like graphic violence. So we wanted to do this since the beginning of my career. It's been 20 years since we first started wanting to do graphic novels for young readers. And we originally tried to pitch to DC and Marvel, and we did actually send a sample script to about Amethyst. There's a DC character named Amethyst, Princess of Gemworld. And we sent it to them saying, we just really think there's a market for younger readers because kids don't go to comic book stores. That's the only place we can get comic books. We need to reach them where they are in their schools and in the libraries and have kid accessible comics because there's so many visual learners and it's just a great medium. At the time, they were not ready for that. But eventually Marvel wanted to do novels. So Squirrel Girl was first, and oh, what fun. She's just a delightful character, and I love writing comedy. And so my husband and I co-wrote 2 novels about Squirrel Girl, and it's about middle school, and they're hilarious. I think they might actually be out of print, sadly, but you probably get them still from a library. They're some of my favorite things that I've ever written. And then the DC came later. They wanted to do graphic novels for young readers, and they said, pick a character. And I was like, are you kidding me? Wonder Woman, obviously.
Yeah.
Like, I grew up in the 70s with the Wonder Woman TV show, and it was like one of the very few shows that had a female main character, and she was powerful. Like, she
Yeah.
was a good secretary. It was mind-blowing to me, and it was formative for me. So to write a graphic novel about young Wonder Woman was so great. So we did 2 of those, and then eventually they said also they wanted us to do Amethyst, Princess of Gemworld, which was the one that we had tried to do 20 years ago. So that has come full circle, and I adore writing for Marvel and DC. It's not the main thing that I do. The main thing I do would be, my own stories and creating my own
Yeah.
stuff. But there is so much joy in writing characters that people have a lot of love for already and already are familiar with, and you get to tell new stories about them.
I think what's incredibly special is that you and your husband Dean have co-written quite a few of your books together, and including the Eisner-winning Rapunzel's Revenge and Calamity Jack, as well as the Squirrel Girl books. So, how do you collaborate on the stories in a sense? Because is it ever stressful, or do things run smoothly? And I guess another question from that would be, do you brainstorm and travel the writing journey together, or do you work better on separate computers or separate playing fields in a sense?
Yeah. It depends on what we're working on because we've done novels and graphic novels and early chapter books together. And so the process is always a little different, but definitely it always starts with brainstorming. Just this morning, we were sitting at the breakfast table, pitching, pitching ideas back and forth for a new Princess in Black that we might write. It's not due for a year, but we're like, what we want to start thinking about it in advance. And we sometimes will go for walks, we'll go for drives, we'll just be pitching ideas back and forth. And then we get to the point where we have enough ideas that we really like, then we start to outline it. One thing about co-writing is you need to outline more than normal. Like when I'm writing just by myself, I can have a pretty rough outline and just sort of follow it or not however I want. But when I'm co-writing, we really do so much of our problem solving in the outline. And then what we often do is split it up. So I'll write we'll assign, like for Squirrel Girl, for example, because that was probably the most intensive and also the most fun co-writing we've done, where I was like, I will take there were several point of view characters. So I'll take first draft of all of the Doreen, which is Squirrel Girl's secret identity. I'll take those from my first pass. Anna Sophia, her best friend, I'll do those first draft. And I'll do half of the Squirrel Girl chapters. And then Dean took the first draft of the Tippy Toe, which is her squirrel friend chapters. And he took the chapters in the point of view of the villain. And then he took the other half of the Squirrel Girl. We had to split up the Squirrel Girl chapters because we both wanted to do it. But then after we write the first draft, I do so many revisions, and I do more of the revising than he does, that we can't really tell who wrote what anymore. And we read it and do notes and we talk about it and then we revise and revise. We rewrite so much that by the end, like even if it was originally my chapter, who knows if a line in it was something I wrote or he wrote or we both wrote. So it does go pretty smoothly. I would say that co-writing, surprisingly, usually takes more time than writing alone. You'd think it would take less time.
Yeah.
But there's just more negotiation. There's more coming to the same place. What you get out of it is the synergy of two different people working together. But it wouldn't necessarily be a time saver.
Well, that's super interesting. And I've never talked to I've talked to authors who wrote together, but they're not necessarily in the same house, So that's really interesting. And one thing that I read about is that you received quite a few rejections along your writing journey, which can be really hard on your confidence when it comes to writing. How did you and how do you bounce back from rejections and continue putting your stories out into the wild world that is publishing?
Yes. I was rejected for everything that I ever sent. I never even could get like a poem or a short story published anywhere. Just had so reams of rejections. And then the first thing that was accepted was The Goose Girl was my first novel.
Yeah.
But that was rejected by everybody. All the who's who of publishers rejected that. And also many agents before finally finding a home with Bloomsbury. And I was the only second book they acquired because they were new in the US. And they had published Harry Potter in England, but didn't have a US publisher. So Scholastic got it in the US. And they wanted to have, so after that, they were like, we need a US publisher so we don't lose out on these things. And so I was the second one that they acquired. And, looking back on that was really interesting because that book was rejected by every publisher that you can name. And they all said things like, they were rough. They said things like, this will not maintain the interest of young readers. And the writing is stiff, cliched, and self-conscious, is what it said. And then it came out and it won a very nice award called the Josette Frank Award. And it was voted by teens across the US as one of the top 10 best books of the year. It has been translated into, I don't know, over 20 languages around the world. 20 years later, it's still in print. It's been through over 30 reprints.
Wow.
I meet people all the time and say it's their favorite book of all time and they reread it yearly. So all of these people that said it was not good enough, they were speaking for themselves. It wasn't right for them. And that's okay, because not all books are right for everybody. But it didn't mean it wasn't right for anyone. And it is hard with rejection to kind of know, okay, have I just not found the right home yet? Or am I not ready yet? is my craft not quite up to par yet? Do I need to keep working? And that is a question I ask myself a lot. I still get rejections. I don't automatically get published just because I've been published. But I am better now at telling, oh, I can see this book is just not ready yet, or that just wasn't the right home for it.
Yeah. Well, I was going to go straight to the last question, but you've really made me think about publishing a lot just from that one little answer. And I think I'm kind of curious what your opinion on this is. So, since middle grade books are for, I mean, of course, anybody can read middle grade books, but the directed audience is middle graders. Do you ever think that middle graders should be the people who read the stories for the publishers and decide if they're right, if they're good, if they're able to be published, if kids will like them?
Oh, that's such a great idea. So I have 4 kids at home now, and that does affect how I write. And I do get in-house help from my from my little focus group. In fact, my I've got 2 13-year-olds. I've got twins who are 13 right now. And I finished a draft of a new middle grade fantasy, and I am paying them both. I'm giving them cash, not a lot, but I'm still giving them cash because they need it, to read it and give me feedback, because I do want feedback from someone who is that age. Should publishers do that? I think publishers would love to do that. But the trick is you can't really employ
That's true.
minors,
Yeah. Maybe
So, and often there's deadlines, and and like there can be a lot of stress and tight deadlines and stuff for writers and editors. So involving minors in that process would be really tricky.
that's
So
true.
I think it's more up to the authors to find young readers and get feedback from them than it could be feasibly the publishers getting in there and making that happen.
Yeah, I agree with that. And now I see with electronic arcs being available now, like a lot of authors find these beta readers to read their stories before they're sent out into the world. And I think that's I mean, of course, if it's a middle grade book, the employment age is 16, so I mean, you can't legally do that. Employ kids, but it's a thought. Maybe one day. Although,
I think it's a great idea. I don't know how that they would enact that, how
yeah,
they would what that would look like logistically.
true.
But I do know I talk to editors all the time, and they were like, would your children read this other manuscript that I'm working on? Could I pay them to do that? So I know that they would like that.
Yeah, and it can also be stressful for the kids, like you said. I
Yeah.
know just like receiving books, especially having like if you receive a lot, reading books is super fun, but sometimes if it feels more like a job, then it like you kind of lose the joy of reading a little bit.
Yeah.
So you don't want kids to lose that joy.
I don't. And that actually, at one point, my oldest was reading a lot of my stories or all my manuscripts for a few years. And when some of my editors asked if they could pay him to do that for them, that's why he decided ultimately no, because he just didn't want the stress and he didn't want to lose the joy.
Yeah. So now it's time for the final question of the interview, which makes me really sad because I've loved this interview.
Me too.
Yeah. Um, from cows, from horses being milked supposedly, to me missaying a book title. It's been a lot of fun and a wild ride, just like, of course, the publishing world. So, the final question is one that I've asked every person that I've ever interviewed. If you could
All right.
be, if you could be or meet any literary character, fictional or real, you could meet your favorite author or you could meet your favorite character in a story. Who would it be and why?
Oh, I'm really bad at picking one thing.
And you can do like three.
But so for example, I love Jane Austen books,
Yeah,
and that's why I wrote Austenland, which is about a woman who's so obsessed with Jane Austen and wishes so much she could live in the books that she goes to this resort where you can have an interactive Austen experience where there's actors pretending to be characters in the story, and you get to feel like what it'd be like to live in the book. So I absolutely would love to like enter Pride and Prejudice and just be there with all of them. But I also would love to enter like Squirrel Girl's world,
Yeah.
all these Marvel characters that I've loved from comics, and the movies and the DC characters, and go to Themyscira and then be super powered, you know. That
Yeah.
would be an added bonus, like hang out with these superheroes that you've loved so much. That would be another one that I would definitely love to do. And, and this may sound self-indulgent or something, but I would love to go to any of my books. You live with it for so long when you're writing and revising. They're so real in my head. To have an experience to actually step into one of your own stories and get to meet your own characters, because
That
they
was
start
so
to
fun.
feel not like my characters anymore. They start to feel real and they feel like friends. Any one of the books I would love to go to.
Yeah, and there are so many answers that you could share. Like you said, Marvel, DC, all of your answers are amazing. And not just for that question, for all the questions. And I've learned a lot. I'm sure everybody listening learned a lot. And they learned a lot about publishing, but also what they want to read. I'm sure they all want to read all of your stories now. Just everybody, round of applause for Shannon Hale, the amazing author. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, E Train. I've enjoyed it so much. But can I ask you one question?
Sure.
What literary character would you want to meet?
I hate it when people throw it back at me. I should have an answer, but I never do. Um,
Doesn't have to be your favorite, just one that pops into your
yeah,
head.
just the first thing that comes to my mind. I like your idea of classics. I think meeting Oliver Twist would be pretty cool. From
Ooh,
Charles Dickens. He's like kind of sly, but he also has a big heart, and I think that meeting somebody like that would be really interesting, a pretty fun adventure.
that would be. That's awesome. Thank you so much, E Train. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. And everybody, you can learn more about Shannon on her website and all of her social sites. They'll be posted in the description of this interview. And I also hope that from this interview, you're not just inspired to read her books, but from her writing advice and writing experiences, you might be inspired to write your own stories. So, Shannon, you have contributed so much to the book world, and I'm so proud to be able to share your story today. And hopefully, if I'm lucky, I might get to meet you in person again one day at maybe another amazing teen author boot camp, or if I'm ever in Utah. So,
Absolutely.
to find out more about Shannon, as I said, you can go to shannonhale.com. And thanks for tuning in, everybody. Until next time, keep on reading, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.